Hey everyone, Budget Nerd here. I love to build computers, and I'm surprised it took this long to get a video about that uploaded to my channel. My power supply started to fail in my office computer, so I decided it was time to shuffle some computers around and build a new rig for my garage, where I do my editing. I like to find a balance between speed and price, and I find that around $600, plus repurposing a few components, is the perfect sweet spot for me. This video will serve to document the process, the components, and could even serve as a guide to build your own should you choose. So let's do this intro thing and get after it. For a computer to start and attempt to boot, you need a few things. One, a motherboard, CPU, RAM or memory, power, and to actually boot to something, a hard drive for your OS or your data. For this build, I only purchased two things, the CPU, which is a Ryzen 7 3700X, and the ROG Strix X570E gaming motherboard by Asus. Since these were the only two items I needed to purchase, I threw all 600 at them. To keep costs down, I used the case, the DVD drives, the audio card, which I ended up not using in the end, the hard drives, the graphics card, which is an older AMD R9 280X, a PCIe SATA card, Bluetooth adapter, and 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM from Crucial, and another power supply I had. Now that we have everything we need, let's check out the motherboard. I picked this one up because I thought it would be somewhat future-proof for a while with its PCIe 4.0, and I like the shiny lights. The CPU is part of the Ryzen 7 series, the 3700X. It's part of the newer Zen 2 architecture, has 8 cores, 16 threads, and I also liked its shiny lights. First, I pulled the motherboard out and put it on its box. I find it easier to install the CPU and the RAM on the motherboard while it's out of the case. It's easier to get to everything, and the box serves as support when pressing stiff components into their slots. The CPU isn't tricky, just line up the pins, using the marks to guide you, and drop it into the slot, no force required. Then lower the arm. For the fan, line up the latches on their tabs and latch it tight. This CPU fan comes with fancy lights and the ability to control them with software, so you have a few extra cables to plug in. USB to control the fan, and the power for the fan. Remember to keep it neat and tidy. Next, grab your RAM and shove it in. Just kidding, you don't want to force it in, but it might take a firm push. Just make sure you have the correct RAM for your motherboard and that it's lined up correctly. It's not backwards compatible, and you could break the RAM or your motherboard if you shove in the wrong kind. That's all I do to the motherboard outside of the case, so let's prepare the case. Start by installing the power supply. Make sure you get one that has enough wattage for your system. If you're using a high-end video card, you'll need more wattage. This one is modular, which means you can unplug and remove any cables you won't use, which cuts down on clutter. I screwed it in, and then started to route the 24-pin power cable. The motherboard sits on these standoffs, which holds the motherboard off the metal of the case so there's no shorting. The old motherboard that was in there was smaller and had fewer standoffs, so we'll need to add a few. Usually your case will come with standoffs, but since I'm reusing mine, I have to fetch my own extras. Luckily, I have lots. I grabbed some, made sure they were the same height, and screwed them in. Check out your motherboard. You'll want a standoff anywhere there is a hole for a screw. If your motherboard has a separate I/O plate, which is common, insert it now into the case. This motherboard has a built-in I/O plate, so I didn't need to worry about that step. Carefully put in the motherboard, making sure you don't damage it. Line up the standoffs with the screw holes and line up your I/O, and then screw it in. Make these screws snug, but don't over-tighten. Route your 24-pin power supply cable to your motherboard's 24-pin port. This case has some built-in cable management, so I'll route it behind and back through a hole right where I need it. Do the same with your CPU power plug. Turned out my CPU power cable wasn't quite long enough to route the way I wanted. Oh well. Next, install the GPU. This GPU is large, and I had to fight to get it in, be careful if you find yourself in the same scenario. You don't want to damage any components. I did finally get it though, and I secured it in place. I routed the power cables for the GPU behind the case and plugged them into the GPU. I also plugged in a chassis fan, and then sat back to check out my handiwork. Next, the buttons on the front panel need to be connected to the motherboard. Here they are: USB, power, reset, lights like your hard drive light or your power light. The motherboard manual will tell you where they should get plugged in, and most third-party cases do a good job of labeling each connector so you know what they are. If you can, route these cables as well to keep things neat. A few connectors like the hard drive light or the power light care about which way they're put on. There's a positive and a negative wire, so if a light isn't working, make sure they're on the right pins, and if they are, pull it off, flip it over, and put it back on. The reset switch and power switch do not care how they're put on. Just get them on the right pins and you're good. Connect the remaining front panel cables, such as audio connector and any USB cables. Plug in any remaining chassis fans you have. At this point, it's coming together nicely, but there are still a few things to do. However, oftentimes at this point, it's a good idea to fire it up and make sure it boots. That way, you don't have to undo or redo steps in case you need to take it apart to troubleshoot. Moving on, these are the hard drives I plan on reusing. The SSD has plenty of life left, and the 1TB drive still works, but actually, it did start to fail on me after I did this build, but I replaced it. I only lost one file, which reminds me, back up your data. If you aren't doing it, do it. You'll thank me later. I put the SSD in its caddy and slid the drives into their final resting places. The DVD drives were already in the case, so now it's time to plug them in. The DVD drives and the hard drives each will need their own SATA cable. Your motherboard should come with a few. Run the SATA cable from your hard drives and the DVD drives to the SATA connectors on the motherboard. The ones on my motherboard were sort of hard to get to when I came from behind the case, but I did get them to work eventually. Next, run the power connectors from the power supply to the drives. I also routed these through the back to keep things neat. You just have to be creative when routing cables sometimes. Next, I spent a bit of time organizing the cables on the back. Do make sure it boots before you start to tie down cables. This case provides some space in the back, but not a ton. When that was done, I slid on the back cover and screwed it on. I almost forgot the PCIe SATA card, but I got it installed and screwed it in place. This card gives me extra SATA cables that are easy to get to when troubleshooting hard drives from other computers. I gave it a quick spit shine and then brought it out to the garage and hooked it all up. Here we are, the moment of truth. Will it fire up? We have those fancy lights, so that's promising. Well, honestly, the first time it didn't come on. I got lights and fans, but nothing on the screen. The computer would just turn itself on and off over and over again. Turned out the RAM was wrong, and after swapping it with the right kind, it fired right up. Final step is to install the spyware, Windows 10. Well, there you have it. My new build. I'm happy with it. And did I mention it has fancy lights? Anyway, thanks for checking out the video. And stay tuned for more drone and camera reviews and other content coming soon.